Alright, so after 897 million days, Jonathan Kuminga is set to make his return this Thursday against Sacramento, and there's a ton of noise about what this team is going to look like with him back in the mix and how the companionship between him and Jimmy will go. Even though there are some positives to him coming back, we gotta be open to certain possibilities that can end up disappointing our expectations. So let's start with the problems that may present themselves when JK comes back to the team. I think it's only fair that we start with the most obvious issue, which is spacing. Now, this was also a topic of concern when the Warriors traded for Jimmy, and it was also one of the reasons why some Warrior fans didn't want Jimmy on this team. And quite frankly, that idea was ludicrous for two reasons. One, Jimmy will not be a movement shooter within the Warriors offense. Two, Jimmy's actually a solid set shooter. Last season, he shot 40% on catch and shoot threes and probably had his best shooting season. Now, obviously, he hasn't been the greatest at knocking down the three ball ever since he suited up for the Warriors. However, he doesn't need to be. The reason why Jimmy and Draymond can be out there on the floor as non-floor spacers is because they are great offensive hubs and screen and roll players. If one of them has the ball, and let's say that guy is Draymond, and the other guy is usually screening or diving to the basket, and let's say that guy is Jimmy, the defender guarding the ball has to make sure he's pressuring to not give up easy passes or open shots off a handoff. And either one of them can do it. Jimmy can be on the ball and make reads, Draymond can do the screen and rolling, or vice versa. Therefore, that makes it harder for the defense to ignore them because they're actively involved in the offense and not just standing in the corner. The Warriors play 5 out most of the time, and it usually creates a ton of space to where defenses have to make decisions on whether or not to put two players on shooters coming off screens. However, if JK is on the floor with Draymond and Jimmy, essentially 3 non-shooters on the floor, that's going to make the defense's job much easier because it guarantees that one of them has to make shots. One of them is guaranteed to be open, especially if they're not involved in the offense. JK has never been a great shooter, but before he got hurt, he actually shot over 40% in his last 10 games. It seemed like he was turning the corner with his 3-ball, and he was getting more confident with it and willing to take them more. But of course, that's not what he does. He's someone exactly like Draymond or Jimmy, where if the defense purposely helps off of them, they need to hit wide open standstill shots to keep the defense honest. We played a lineup of JK, Draymond, and TJD to start the season, 3 non-shooters, and it was a disaster to start the season because the driving lanes were clogged. Championship teams only have 1 or 2 non-shooters on the floor. Anything more than that is not going to lead to winning because come playoff time, there will be certain teams that have great game plan discipline and they'll scheme against that where they'll deny Steph off the ball and they'll completely sag off of Draymond and Jimmy. And if you add JK to that, another option where the defense can help off of, at that point it just becomes an inefficient offense. The second issue is that Jimmy and JK have similar play styles where any action involving the two of them is likely going to result in an empty possession in terms of advantage creation. We know about the inverted ball screens set for Jimmy with Steph's defender because it causes a positional advantage. Jimmy sets a rip screen to force a switch onto a smaller guard and seals him. Things like that give Jimmy and Steph an advantage. But I've been watching how defenses guard actions involving Jimmy and Draymond, and most of the time, the defense will just switch. And to be honest, they have no reason not to. Sometimes Jimmy's defender will drop under, or they might play a drop coverage and allow Draymond to shoot above the break threes. So now if you're thinking about how it would possibly look with JK and Jimmy, it'll probably be about the same. Things can get a little clunky, and it'll force Jimmy and JK to run ISOs, screen with another player, or run some sort of other action. It's also gonna force Jimmy and JK away from the basket. They might have to settle for more jump shots, and that's where the offense can take a hit with both of them on the court. The third issue is that JK is a player that needs the ball to really affect the game on the offensive side of the floor. Off the ball, he's not a floor spacer. He's not a great closeout attacker. He is good at something else that I'll get into later, but he's one of the worst mid-range scorers in the NBA. The only thing he's good at is finishing at the rim and getting fouled, similar to Jimmy, but it's not the same. JK is a guy where you throw him the ball and he'll drive to get downhill. You set him an inverted ball screen, or you have him aggressively attack a drop coverage, and he can get to the rim and finish. Jimmy is a guy who can do a mix of that, but also he's a good screen and roll guy where he can force switches, seal guys on his top side, catch the ball through traffic, go up with it, and finish the play. You've seen Jimmy get a lot of alley-oop layups doing this. JK doesn't possess that ability where he can score physically underneath the basket like that. He's not nearly the same type of post threat that Jimmy is, and JK isn't a good enough passer to where he can take Draymond's role and find Jimmy screening and sealing on the backside. So let's look at some solutions to these problems. The first one is just constant off-ball cuts, whether it's baseline cuts, slipping out of screens, or diving to the basket. Earlier I said JK is actually good at something off the ball, and that is cutting from the baseline. Jimmy does this thing where he frequently touches the paint and he looks to pass before scoring, and in those situations, if the defense helps off of JK and he can time a baseline cut and finish strong at the rim or get fouled, that's something that can potentially work. Earlier I said that any action between Jimmy and JK will likely get switched with no advantage. When the defense switches, there's a very small window to slip out of it, and either Jimmy or JK can slip to the basket. Jimmy himself does a great job of this. That's also something that JK needs to do. If the defense puts 2 on Steph off the ball, dive to the basket so it can create scoring opportunities. Secondly, JK needs to crash the glass like crazy. The defense is going to sag off of him off the ball, meaning there's nobody that will get a body on him early. He needs to corner crash like crazy like Pods and Guy Santos, or even like the Thompson twins. Take advantage of the defense not guarding you from the perimeter. Even in transition as well, if somebody has a wide open transition layup, crash behind them just in case they miss, and you can clean it up. Thirdly, maybe Steve Kerr might look into splitting Jimmy and JK's minutes, and this is where you might see less of Steph and Jimmy together, to where JK is going to play with Steph and Jimmy is going to spend a lot of time with QP. That bench unit with Jimmy, Draymond, Post, Pods, and Buddy is actually a pretty good second unit. And this goes back to solving the spacing issue, because you just can't give the defense a whole lot of options to help off of and make their schemes a lot easier. And lastly, let's highlight the benefits that JK can bring to the team when he comes back. Firstly, he can take more of the POA responsibility. We already know that the Warriors are a more vulnerable defense out in space, and we don't really have a great POA defender. Jimmy isn't a POA defender, but occasionally he does have to switch or chase a guy off a screen, and at times he's been solid, but other times he's been pretty bad, where he just dies on too many screens. His perimeter foot speed isn't exactly what it once was, and it leads to easy penetration. Jimmy can switch and guard, it's just that's not where he's at his best at this stage in his career. And JK, even though I've criticized his POA defense in the past, he's actually been pretty good this season. Having him guard the other team's best or second best player allows for Jimmy to roam around and be a help side defender rather than pulling him out in space. Secondly, there's overall more defensive versatility. If you have Dre, Jimmy, and JK in the front court, you essentially have 3 guys that can switch from positions 1 through 4, 1 through 5 if you're Draymond. So in the events where you have no choice but to switch the action, you wouldn't mind it because you have enough defensive talent to where it's not a bad idea. And the last thing is just JK's lob threat ability allows for Jimmy's playmaking to flourish even more. Most of the time when Jimmy is making reads off his drives or the short roll, he never has an option to throw it over the top. But now with JK in the mix and with his cutting ability, Jimmy has all the options now. He can find shooters in the corner or the wing, or he can lob it up, and that's going to place a whole lot of pressure on the defense, because not only can Jimmy score in that position, but if you give him all the possible passing options in which he can make all of those passes, you're going to be in trouble.